Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about my 6 predicted nerfs for the Eldar in 10th edition. So as we all know, in September, GW is going to be releasing a new balanced Dataslate, which is supposedly going to balance the mess that is the meta right now. And it really hasn't been this bad since 9th edition when GW was releasing a bunch of overpowered codexes like the Tyranids, or trying to rein in armies that were very high skill capped like the Harlequins. Unfortunately, though, in a lot of ways, that has kind of bled over into 10th edition, where some of the indexes got a lot of love, like ours, and some of them didn't, like the Leagues of Votann and others, for various reasons, right? I mean, we could go through all the indexes and talk about what issues they have and how to make them better and things like that. But what we do know for sure is that the Eldar are performing way better than they should in top-level competitive play. And I do want to make a comment about this because, as you guys know, this channel is primarily an Eldar channel. We go over basically all things Eldar and even dabbled in some Dark Eldar. And I have to say, since the start of the edition, when the Eldar Index came out, I think that the Eldar Index at its core is well designed. And I'm going to stay behind that because I've played Eldar for many years, over 20 now, actually. And I've seen their many iterations over that period of time. So when the rules came out and we looked at Strands of Fate and we looked at Unparalleled Mastery and we saw that and we saw some of the units previewed, I thought it was a very well-designed core, right? We have a good core set of rules that work very well in the game. However, those core rule designs are not necessarily broken or OP. What's really OP is that when you combine those excellent core rules, the solid core rules, with insane data sheets that just do way too much damage or interact in the game in a very undesirable way. And that's what I've been arguing from the beginning, that the problem isn't with the core rules because every single army should have a strong core rule set that every player should feel happy about fielding, right? And unfortunately, that's not the case with every army in 10th edition. Eldar got a really good core rule set. Guess what? Other factions didn't. And that's definitely not right. I think they should be fixed, right? Like the Leagues of Votann detachment ability and army rule should be buffed to where Leagues of Votann players actually feel good about using it. And I think every single faction in the game deserves this. We all deserve to feel good about using our army rules and detachment bonuses. However, what no player should feel good about is using broken data sheets alongside the core rules to create broken interactions in the game that are so oppressive that the other player can't really interact or have any fun. And that's unfortunately what the Eldar have done in this edition. And it has skyrocketed our win rate in tournaments to insane levels. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to discuss what I think GW is going to target in September for the Eldar and why I agree or disagree with those changes. And again, I'm not in charge of these things. I just kind of observe, right? I'm just a veteran of the game, just like a lot of you out there who observes what's going on in the community, who observes what's going on in their own games and comes to their own conclusion. So a lot of this is my opinion, but what I will say is the Eldar are not in the best place right now competitively. They're just way too strong, and that's because the top builds are all using pretty much the same units, which are the units that I talked about earlier that interact with the core rules in a way that makes them utterly broken. So without further ado, let us go ahead and jump right in the video and talk about the 6 predicted nerfs for the Eldar in 10th edition. But first, a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at in today's video. We're going to be looking at the problem with the Eldar in competitive play at the moment, the 6 nerfs I expect to see GW impose in the September balanced Dataslate, and lastly, making the case that Strands of Fate and Unparalleled Foresight are not the reason Eldar are so broken. So that's another thing, guys. On this channel, I've been saying Unparalleled Mastery probably for the last like 10 videos, or maybe even since the beginning of 10th. So hopefully you guys picked up on that and knew what I was talking about when I mentioned Unparalleled Mastery in my former videos. I actually meant the detachment bonus, Unparalleled Foresight. All right, so what is the problem with the Eldar in competitive play at the moment? And basically it boils down to this. The top units in the Eldar index have extremely low interaction in the game when built correctly. So Wraith Knights, for example, with towering and devastating wounds on the heavy Wraith cannons, can solo armies with the right support. So opponents can't take saves against them because devastating wounds is pretty insane. As mortal wounds carry over. And that means devastating wound weapons are essentially good against everything. No matter if it's infantry, vehicles, monsters, absolutely everything, ignoring armor and invulns alike. Towering ignores line of sight, of course, and, unless there's true line of sight blocking stuff on the table, your army's pretty much going to be open season. Fire prisms can almost never be shot at effectively because they have linked fire, which is absolutely free. You don't have to pay any resources for it whatsoever. And on top of that, fire prisms are just really solid. They don't require much support. And with a simple one command point phantasm, you can get the fire prism that just shot out of line of sight again so that even that one doesn't have any risk. We have several fantastic lone operatives who can't be shot outside of 12 inches and are very good, like the Death Jester and the Solitaire. But also the Autarch Wayleaper, who may not be a great combatant, but farms command points for you every turn and helps keep your units from being battle shocked so they can still control objectives in the backfield when needed. Lastly, we have several extremely undercosted units that just do too much damage for their cost, or just have too much mobility. So things like Warp Spiders or Shadow Specters have a lot of damage and they have high mobility. And for those things, having high damage and high mobility, you would think that they would be, a little bit more expensive, but they're actually not, right? Warp Spiders only cost 100 points. They can move 24 inches a turn, which is pretty insane for objective play, and they have torrent weapons with devastating wounds. So if somebody wants to advance and engage them in close combat, which is going to be their, one weak spot, they're going to have trouble getting through that Overwatch. Shadow Specters, on the other hand, have great damage against mostly every target below toughness 5. They can kill 3-wound models like Terminators very easily. They can also kill hordes with their blast weapons. So they have very good and versatile damage, high mobility with a move, shoot, move ability, and indirect fire defense with a 3+ armor save and stealth. So they're very effective at their points cost of just 80. Which makes them one of the toughest units to deal with for their cost in the entire game. Okay, so these are the 6 nerfs I expect to see GW impose in the September balanced data slate. Now keep in mind, I don't agree with all these nerfs. I just think GW is going to target these things because, well, it's GW. And GW often doesn't look for the real root of the problem. They kind of target things here and there and see what sticks, right? What's going to bring their win rate down, what's not. Let's throw a bunch of little things at them and see what actually does it, right? And historically, GW has taken the position that it's better to over-nerf a faction than to under-nerf it and not fix the problem of it being OP in competitive play, regardless of whether or not that's actually the reason they are so good. So let's go ahead and get right into what nerfs I am expecting. So first of all, I think there is going to be some sort of change to mortal wounds, or the removal of devastating wounds from D weapons. So the devastating wound interaction with high damage weapons is ridiculous. Even after the Fate Dice nerfs basically did nothing to curb this, it's basically able to destroy anything effortlessly. Like I said before, you could ignore armor, you could ignore invulns, and oftentimes you can just ignore line of sight because the Wraith Knight has towering. So, that's a big problem. And this isn't the first time they've had an issue with mortals this edition. Remember the Death Watch at the beginning of 10th that could basically do upwards to 40+ mortal wounds with a single combination. So, it's not just the Eldar who have escaped the magnifying glass of GW's rule writers before. So removing them from D weapons, I think would probably balance the weapons out nicely. So I know a lot of you are probably thinking to yourselves, Proxy Hammer, what are you saying? The D weapons having devastating wounds makes sense. I mean, after all, they're called D weapons, right? And in the lore, that's exactly what they do. They basically open up the warp and suck their opponents right in. And while I don't disagree, I think lore-wise, yeah, it makes perfect sense to have devastating wounds. I think it doesn't balance out the weapons well because as mortal wounds are currently written, it doesn't really make sense to take the other options when you could just proc something that has a bunch of mortal wounds and can be effective against literally any target. So if you want to balance out the options, I think you remove devastating wounds from the Wraith Cannon, from the heavy Wraith Cannon, the D Cannon, things like that, and you either replace it with something else, or you rewrite mortal wounds themselves so that they're a little bit less oppressive. And I personally would be a fan of them just rewriting the mortal wound rule itself, but in the absence of that, at least changing devastating wounds to maybe some other special ability that the Wraith weapons or D weapons could have would, again, like I said, balance that out a little bit. All right, so the second nerf I see coming is that towering no longer ignores obscuring terrain. So this was a bit of a weird thing that they introduced at the beginning of 10th, where towering units basically just ignored ruins for line of sight purposes, which was ridiculous and a big mistake. So towering has basically become, as a result, a first turn auto win in a lot of gaming environments. Armies that have towering units that also shoot very effectively are unsurprisingly very powerful. And because of that, tournaments have had to implement a lot more true line of sight blocking terrain and or close the windows on the bottom story of ruins to give other armies a chance of getting out of the first turn alive. And I've said this before and I'll say it again, this reminds me of the old days where true line of sight ruled, and basically you couldn't hide unless you had true line of sight blocking terrain, and that made it hard for a lot of armies in the game to perform anywhere close to well in competitive play. And especially as somebody who played competitive Warhammer 40k in tournaments and things like that in 5th edition, I can assure you guys that the competitive scene was not a very balanced place. So, why is this a problem for Eldar? Well, guess what? We have the Wraith Knight, and the Wraith Knight is one of the biggest offenders because not only does it have towering, but it also has devastating wounds. So it can see its targets, ruins or not, and it can also shoot them with devastating wounds. So not only is there no place to hide, but the Wraith Knight has enough firepower to ensure its target's destruction pretty much each and every time. So I do see them tweaking this a little bit. If they don't tweak, again, the points cost of towering units, they're definitely going to make it so that towering units no longer ignore obscuring terrain. Next up is Strands of Fate. So Strands of Fate is one of those things I think would be a mistake to change. I think it's already been kind of brought down low enough to where it's balanced. A lot of people might disagree with me on that, but I'm going to stay firm and say I don't really think you guys are looking at it the right way. So basically what Fate dice do now is you can only use one per phase. However, the top competitive lists are fielding compositions that can efficiently blow through almost all the Fate dice in 3 turns, turning a lot of them into 6s. And on most units, this wouldn't be that big of a deal. Changing a 6 on a damage roll on a Bright Lance isn't really the most powerful thing, right? It's fair, it's balanced, it's justified. But turning those dice into 6s on things like Wraith Knights, and it becomes a different story. And I think this just simply goes back to how broken a mechanic devastating wounds can be on certain units. And that goes, again, back to how mortal wounds work and things like that. I also sense that the starting amount of Fate dice might be reduced to 6, and instead of just getting the full 12 right away, we will get 1 dice per round after that in an effort to prevent burning through them all in the first couple of turns, which I actually don't mind. I think this would actually incentivize people to start using Guardian Defenders again, start using maybe Wraith Lords again in an effort to get some more Fate dice on the table so that you can obviously modify those to 6s and things like that so that you could, efficiently use your Fate dice. So if they do implement that change, I think that would be fine. But, if they just flat out reduce the number of Fate dice you get and just say, okay, well, instead of 12, you're now getting 6, and that's all you get for the rest of the game, good luck. I don't think that would be a very good change, and actually I think it would be kind of shitty. All right, so the next nerf I foresee is some sort of change to Unparalleled Foresight. And I think what they're going to do is they're going to make it so that it only activates once per turn. So currently it's every time a unit shoots or fights, so it works with out-of-sequence shooting as well, like Overwatch and War Construct. And this allows units to utilize it for both shooting and combat as well in the same turn. And I think that maybe this is just too powerful because, Overwatch is already a very powerful mechanic. So again, I think this, it's funnily enough, everything goes back to the Wraith Knight, right? So Unparalleled Foresight, when combined with the Wraith Knight, just gives that model even greater amount of threat, right? So now, not only is it being able to devastate in your turn, but it's also able to devastate enemy units in the opponent's turn when they move forward within 24 inches of it. So I think by maybe limiting it to once per turn, you're preventing that from happening. Again, I don't think this is a necessary change. I just think this requires the Wraith Knight to be nerfed a little bit with either devastating wounds or towering. Make changes to those rules, and you don't have to touch Unparalleled Foresight. I think Unparalleled Foresight is a great detachment rule, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's OP in and of itself. Okay, so number 5, I also foresee point hikes or ability nerfs for most undercosted units. So units like Shadow Specters, Warp Spiders, Hornets, and Fire Prisms, to name a few, are probably a bit too cheap for the damage and utility they bring to the table. I expect Specters to increase to 100 points for 5, which I think would be fair considering their damage output and synergy combinations. Spiders, I think, will increase to 120, or their ability will be limited to once per game. And for those of you who don't know this, spiders actually have a 24-inch move. So basically what you do with them is you move 24 inches somewhere on the board, preferably out of line of sight of most units, except maybe the target unit that you're going to shoot at. You shoot them with Torrent and Devastating Wounds, and then in their turn, when they try to move, you overwatch them, hitting them with another round of shooting. So you're essentially getting to shoot twice with that unit of spiders for only 1 command point, which is absolutely insane. So I think they should probably either nerf their points, increase their points a little bit, or limit their ability to once per game. Prisms and Hornets will probably see a 20-point increase as well. I think Hornets are probably a little cheap at 80 points. They probably should be 100, closer to the Warwalker. Again, they're very fast and pack 2 heavy weapons, which synergizes really well with our detachment bonus and things like that. So I think they should probably be a little bit more expensive. Not super expensive, but at least 100 points I think would be fair. The Prisms, on the other hand, I think are probably still too cheap just because of the fact that linked fire is such a great ability to have on them, and they don't need to spend any resources on it like they did before. So, I think they'll probably get a points increase of some kind. If they don't get a points increase, then maybe change linked fire a little bit so that if the fire prism that's shooting doesn't have direct line of sight to the target and instead is using another fire prism to draw line of sight, then that enemy unit will get the benefit of cover and -1 to hit, just like as if it's out of line of sight from an indirect fire weapon. So I think that's probably a change that you're likely to see, or just GW will be lazy about it and just increase their points. Okay, so lastly, we have limitations to Phantasm and Fire and Fate. So I expect to see either a command point increase to Phantasm or a limit on what units can use the stratagem. So for example, maybe Phantasm cannot be used on vehicles and monsters. So currently it can be basically used on anything, including things like fire prisms and stuff like that. And maybe that's just a little bit too much for only a single command point. So either I expect them to increase the command points of Phantasm or limit the ability's use on certain models. And I also see this happening. Maybe it costs 1 command point normally, but if you're targeting a vehicle or a monster, it costs 2 command points to use Phantasm. And I think that would also be a fair move there as well. All right, so like I said at the beginning of the video, I do want to make the case that Strands of Fate and Unparalleled Foresight are not the reason Eldar are so broken. And I keep hearing this time and time again from people, not only in the comments, but also from my local gaming group. It's not something that has escaped many communities. Everyone at this point seems to be pointing to every single special rule that Eldar have and, with the torch saying, it's broken, burn it to the ground, nerf it. And I just don't think that's a productive way to look at things as far as balance goes, right? Because then you don't actually address the real issues and you're just putting a band-aid on something that it's going to rear its ugly head again later on. So, I really think the reason these army abilities seem ridiculously OP is because they're being used and abused on some of the most problematic data sheets in the game, like the Wraith Knight. And yes, the Wraith Knight with the double heavy Wraith Cannon is a very problematic unit. Even at 475 points, it's drastically way too strong for the game. And in combination with the right support, it just absolutely destroys armies just by itself. So again, I think if you fix the Wraith Knight datasheet, you fix towering, you fix devastating wounds, you're going to be in a better place with units like that. And other datasheets as well. You know, if you increase the cost of things like Shadow Specters, Warp Spiders, and Fire Prisms, or at least change their abilities or nerf their abilities a little bit, then their performance will stabilize and you'll have a more balanced interaction in the game, right? So if Warp Spiders can only use their ability once per game, you know, they're going to use it once, but then they're shit out of luck. They're only going to be able to move 12 inches after that and still be able to shoot and do stuff. So that'll give your opponent an opportunity to capitalize on that later in the game. On the other hand, Shadow Specters, if they're more points, will do damage more equatable to their actual cost. So, you know, you won't get so many situations where the Eldar player is just out competing you for value every single turn. And trust me, guys, I think if you make changes to the datasheets themselves and maybe tweak a few of the core rules like Devastating Wounds and Towering, you're going to get a much different experience against Eldar players. And the other nerfs that we've been talking about, you know, in regards to the Detachment Special rule and also the Army rule will seem much less oppressive. And as for the other factions out there who are really struggling right now, they're like 40% and below in win rate in tournaments. If you nerf the Eldar in this way, your win rates will increase, right? If you're able to hide from Wraith Knights via the Towering rule getting changed and Mortal Wounds getting changed, then your units are going to be able to survive and, of course, interact better with that Eldar opponent that you're going up against. And, you know, I would also expect this September to get some considerable buffs for your army. So if your army is one of those that is sitting below 40%, you know, you're the Leagues of Votann, you're the Sisters of Battle and things like that, you're really down in the dumps, I would expect to see some changes and, you know, you can look forward to having a better experience in 40K. Okay, so in conclusion, the Eldar are definitely going to see some hard nerfs in September, and any unit being used consistently in high-level competitive play will be in the crosshairs, and for good reason. What I do hope, however, is that the nerfs are fair and do not inadvertently affect units that are not tournament staples. And it's pretty funny because I've heard some people on YouTube crying that, you know, every single Eldar unit in the entire index is underpriced and overpowered and stuff like that. And it's just so funny. It's clear that these people aren't actually Eldar players. They have no experience using the units in games or anything like that. And they're just basically crying to the heavens for salvation because they don't know how to deal with those really highly competitive, uninteractive Eldar lists that are topping the tournaments at the moment. And that's understandable, right? I mean, if you go up against something that seems unbeatable, of course you're going to scream that it's broken and maybe the whole codex or index is broken, right? That makes sense. I don't blame you guys for that. You know, I've been in that position before too. In 5th edition, when I was playing a 4th edition Eldar codex, and it was a really old 4th edition Eldar codex, it basically had rules that didn't even work anymore in it. When I would go up against armies like Blood Angels and Imperial Guard and all the new stuff that people were fielding with new codexes, you know, geared and ready to go for 5th edition, there were times where I would sit down after a game and really think about what I could have done against that list to win, and there was just nothing, right? I mean, I don't know how many of you went up against a Blood Angels list in 5th edition when they had free transports. Basically, you took as many free transports, as many Razorbacks as you possibly could, gave them all Last Cannon and Plasma Gun, and just went to town. And there was just nothing you could do about it because they had so much more stuff than you did. All of your units were overcosted, all of their units were undercosted, and it was a bad time overall. I totally understand that feeling, and that's probably what some of you feel when you're going against one of those, you know, top Eldar lists. But it's actually important to sit down and actually think about what's really causing the issue so that we can make a better game for everybody involved, Eldar players included. And yes, I do mean Eldar players. I know that we are pretty much top dogs right now in competitive play. But it's also important to note that not every Eldar player out there is looking to run the most meta, most broken Eldar list that they can so that they can win all the tournaments. There's a lot of players out there who like running the, you know, less competitive units. And should those players be punished because of what the top competitive players are running in their lists? No, of course not, right? I mean, those players are probably going to enjoy the game no matter what, but, they shouldn't suffer and they shouldn't have some of their fun taken away because the competitive players decided to meta chase. So, the key is finding the real problems, finding the ways to bring down the top level competitive lists in a way that's fair and not also just gut the entire army and make it unfun for those who are playing at a less competitive level. And then that way, everybody wins, right? Because that's the end goal of this game anyway, is to have fun and make sure that everybody is having a fun time, win or lose. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Thank you to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last months. Your help is greatly appreciated, and we're coming up to a year so far on the channel, which is awesome. I never actually expected to, have a good community behind this channel supporting the Craftworld Eldar. And that really does warm my heart, and I think, obviously, the Eldar community is one of the best and most supportive in the entire game. So if you do want to become a part of our community, I do have free trials activated on my Patreon. You guys can join for free at no cost to you, and that gets you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players who like talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description if you are interested. I also have a channel store page for those of you looking to rep some Eldar-inspired apparel at your local game store, and I'm an Amazon affiliate in case you're interested in getting some discounted Eldar from Amazon and also helping the channel at the same time. I will leave all those affiliate links in the description as well. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. We got mandrakes tomorrow. We're going to be talking about mandrakes in the Ynnari armies, and I will see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.